Now, tonight's top story, the Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police has admitted the force made mistakes in its policing of pro-Palestine protests, particularly in the early stages back in October. Speaking to the think tank Policy Exchange, Matt Twist cited the decision not to immediately arrest demonstrators shouting jihad as an example of the Met not acting decisively enough during those protests. However, he also insisted that police tactics had since developed and strongly rejected any accusations of two-tier or differential policing. Well, joining me now in the studio is one of the authors of that report, of the head of crime and justice at the Policy Exchange, David Spencer. And of course, I'm joined by my panel. And tonight, that's GB News' senior commentator, Nigel Nelson, and the former Conservative MP, Michael Brown. Gentlemen, welcome to the studio. Let's start with you, if we could, David. So the report came out, and many people watching the show might say, well, thank God the report is proving what we kind of all suspected all along. The evidence seemed to be manifest that the police were standing off against the Palestine protesters, but they were putting the boot in, or worse, to those on the other side. Tell us about your report.
Thanks very much. Good evening. I think one of the big findings that we have when we look at particularly the mood of the public, what do the British people actually think about protests? And we look at the way the police are operating and the legal regime itself, the law, we see there's a really big gulf. There's a big gap between the law and the way the police are operating and the mood of the public. So, for example, we asked people, would you come into central London or another town and city if there's a major protest going on? And a huge proportion, over 2/3 of people said they would defer their plans. They would not come into London if there was a major protest going on. And interestingly, when we broke the data down, we actually looked and we saw that that was more likely to be the case for women and older people. The second thing that we particularly found when we looked at the polling results was that when we said, what sort of support do you have for the police taking robust action, taking action when people are doing different sorts of things in a protest? So, for example, if they're approaching people to shout at them, if they're carrying racist or derogatory placards, if they're damaging property, overwhelming numbers here. 85% of people said the police should be stepping in and preventing protesters from doing those sorts of things.
And yet, when we saw signs, particularly in those early days, there were protesters cited in this report crying for jihad. We saw protesters with Hamas headbands on, with ISIS flags. We saw people trampling on war memorials. We even saw children in fancy dress as Hamas terrorists posing for photographs with the police. Very, very early on, a lot of people were standing by watching this thinking, hang on a minute. Now, uniformity of the law is not being applied here. Policing without fear or favour seemed to go out of the window. There was particular fear, many people believe, of putting the boot in to the pro-Palestine protesters, and yet we didn't see that, for example, at Cenotaph or the Enough is Enough protest ones that I went to. Does this report, and in particular you spoke to Matt Twist, the Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, do they admit that they can improve, or was this a kind of, yeah, we acknowledge some of the things you're saying, but anyway, we're going to carry on as normal?
I think my first thought is I really credit the Assistant Commissioner, Matt Twist, because he said he was quite open to me that they'd not got everything right. And I think to have a public servant, a very senior public servant, who's willing to go on the record and say, actually, we didn't get everything right, that's no bad thing. And to be honest, we could probably do with more of that sort of thing, and we might not have some of the difficulties we have. So I actually think all credit to Matt Twist for being willing to be open about that. I think the real issue when we look at the sort of two-tier discussion, or we call it differential policing in the report, the real issue is it's very difficult to get to grips with what's actually going on because so much of this is behind closed doors by the police. So, for example, we have no idea often who the community leaders they're consulting with. We have no idea what the advice is that they're receiving, no idea about what these meetings are like and what action the police are taking as a result of the advice they're receiving. So the real problem is the lack of transparency here, and the first step that needs to happen is the police need to be far more open, far more transparent about the advice they're receiving from different groups.
And David Spencer, some of the data you mentioned there is pretty eye-opening. I mean, there's a direct admission by the general public here. They give these protests a wide berth, not only through sense of perhaps their own fears, and I wonder what the Jewish community would have said if you'd have polled them, but also evidence of clear economic damage to our cities and our towns when these protests are going on. People are simply staying away.
Undoubtedly. And although it's not in the report, certainly in some of the research conversations we had with businesses, with retailers, hoteliers, these sorts of organisations, they say they've been really heavily affected by major protests. And they're very, very concerned about the economic impact, both on their businesses, but more broadly as well. It's a really serious problem, and one certainly that the Mayor of London should be getting to grips with as well.
Yeah, he's been notably silent on a lot of this. Now, David, before I bring in my panel, can I just show a few clips of protests that I got involved directly in myself? Here's one here. This was some time ago. You remember that projector? That's the projector right there, projecting onto Big Ben, and it put the image onto Big Ben of From the River to the Sea. You can see that there. I'm stood right by this projector. Those images were beamed around the world. On this protest, I was going right up to coppers and saying, that's an offence. To project onto that building is an offence. That's an insulting image many believe to be clear anti-Semitism. Will you go and do something about it? They had no interest whatsoever. Not a sausage. I also got egged at that protest because men were in full ski masks, and these were the Palestine protesters, and I was saying to them, to the coppers, go and nick those blokes. And in return for that, I got egged, and guess what? Nobody get arrested. Let's go on to the next clip. This was at the Cenotaph just a few weeks ago. This was the Enough is Enough protest. I got handcuffed by protesters here. I was simply doing the same job as before. I was filming the unrest there. Section 14 order. I got handcuffed on my wrist. Mercifully, I was the recipient of two-tier policing because one of the coppers recognised me. And they said, no, he's from GB News, and they let me go. But about 115 people didn't get let go that night. They got nicked under a dispersal order. And I just maintain, David Spencer, that this kind of thing is direct evidence. And I've been at these ones at the protests at the Cenotaph in November where several men were bat on, and there was blood all over the place. The images are actually too distressing to show on TV at this time of night. So the evidence of those who actually go there and go on the ground points to clear two-tier policing. And yet, in this report, noble, laudable report, they still reject claims of two-tier policing.
And this is the problem, as I say, about transparency, is that we simply have no idea or no clear idea how the police are making these judgments, how they're making the decisions, what the advice is they're getting from lawyers, from community groups, from the Crown Prosecution Service. And without getting the insight into what they're actually thinking, I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but what they're actually thinking, how they're making their decisions, we simply can't determine. It's very difficult to diagnose just what the problem is and how we solve it. So we need that transparency from the police.
Great. So let's bring my panel in now, Nigel Nelson and Michael Brown. Nigel, perhaps I could start with you. I suspect you will echo Matt Twist, the Assistant Commissioner of the Met's sentiments when he says there is no such thing as two-tier policing. Yet the evidence and this report seem to intimate that's not the case.
Well, I mean, what Matt Twist told David, which actually really struck me, was that no, there isn't two-tier policing. There are infinite tiers of policing. And what it depends on is... Well, what it depends on is the threat that the protesters pose, the harm that they might cause, and the risk to the public. And so what the police do is change their ways of policing depending on what the circumstances are. Now, OK, I think it was great that he admitted there were mistakes made, that they should have arrested people for shouting jihad earlier than they did. They had a bit of a problem, I think, about the legal definition of whether they could do it. But the important thing is that the police are operationally independent, and what they were doing there is saying, right, we must actually police proportionately, and we must put public safety first.
Michael Brown, do you buy that, this intimation that the police is policing without fear or favour, or does the evidence suggest to you that there's clear fear of one community and favour towards that same community?
Well, I'm afraid I disagree entirely with Nigel. I live just south, a few hundred yards south of Vauxhall Bridge Road. Yeah. And when these protests were really going full pelt in October, November, up to Christmas, if you lived in my street, Looper Street, which joins Vauxhall Bridge Road, no civilian, sensible person would be able to go shopping in the Sainsbury's in Vauxhall Bridge Road, which is where I do my my shopping, usually on a Saturday afternoon. Can't do that when any of those protests are going on. So it's two-tier policing to this extent. The ordinary citizen going about their business who lives in my area of Pimlico, who wants to go shopping or wants to go to Victoria Station, nobody in their right mind, if they're my age, would go anywhere near the protesters. There's no police doing... It's two-tier policing to this extent. While the police are tied up dealing with, or rather not dealing with these protesters, we don't have any policing whatsoever when the spillover takes place on their way to the American embassy. That's why they're going along Vauxhall Bridge Road. As far as the police are concerned, it's all done and dusted when it's finished at Parliament, but it's not done and dusted when you're in my street about half an hour later.
David Spencer, can I bring you in for a quick final comment? We're, of course, approaching the anniversary, October the 7th, of that terrorist invasion, that prorogue by Hamas into Israel. And these protests aren't going anywhere soon, a particularly sensitive moment, that first anniversary. There's likely to be a big protest around that date. Do you get any inclination or sense that the Met are prepared for this or are preparing for this? Could be a huge flashpoint.
I'm very sure they will be preparing for it. I've got no doubt that it's in their minds. And certainly based upon the conversation that I had with Assistant Commissioner Twist from the Met that we've already talked about, how they police these protests and the decisions they make is undoubtedly uppermost in their mind. They'll be very concerned about how October the 7th goes and the policing of it, no doubt at all.
Do you think that the police operate under a sense of... I mean, I've been to the protests and they get toured up, they put the batons in, they kettle people. You might call them right-wingers, the police might call them far-right, but they don't police like that on the pro-Palestine protests, and that precipitates far fewer arrests. Can we expect to see the police, on occasions like that, do you think, actually getting toured up and going into that crowd with the same vim?
I mean, there have been incidents where we have seen that, but it is, as Nigel said, it is, the police are dealing with different situations and are dealing with, in fairness, what is a very challenging situation. Certainly the legal regime, as we cover in the report, doesn't help them at all in this. And this is something the new government really needs to take seriously and look at. Otherwise, they'll find themselves in the same mire that their predecessors found themselves in. It's really difficult for the police. I think they'll be really concerned about October the 7th.
Superb report. Thanks for sharing with us, David Spencer. And thanks to my panel, of course, Michael Brown and Nigel Nelson. Thank you very much indeed.